Missiles tear across the night sky over Iran. Seconds later, explosions ripple through the outskirts of Tehran. Air defenses fire blindly into the darkness as another wave of strikes hits military bases, missile factories, and command centers across the country. Within hours, the news spreads across the world. Iran's supreme leader, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic for nearly 4 decades, is dead. The strike was part of a massive U.S. and Israeli air campaign that, in just days, would hit nearly 2,000 targets across Iran. For a moment, many believed the war might end quickly. If the leadership collapsed, the system might collapse with it. But that isn't what happened. Instead, Iran retaliated. Missiles and drones launched toward Israel and American-linked targets across the region. The conflict escalated almost overnight. And as the war entered its second week, a question began to dominate the global conversation. What exactly is Donald Trump trying to achieve? Because as the bombs continued to fall, the answers seemed to keep changing. The war began before dawn on February 28th. In the early hours of the morning, waves of U.S. and Israeli aircraft and missiles struck targets across Iran. The attacks were coordinated, rapid, and massive in scale. Military bases were hit first, then missile production facilities, then radar installations and air defense systems. Within hours, the campaign expanded to include nuclear infrastructure, energy facilities, and key government sites. The strikes reached deep into the heart of the country, including Tehran itself. According to reports, nearly 2,000 targets were hit during the first phase of the operation. But the most shocking moment came with a single announcement. Among those killed in the opening strikes was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. For 37 years, Khamenei had been the most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic. He had overseen Iran's military strategy, its nuclear ambitions, and its long rivalry with both Israel and the United States. Removing him in the opening hours of the war was an extraordinary escalation. To some observers, it suggested a bold and dangerous strategy. If the leadership of Iran could be decapitated quickly enough, perhaps the entire system would unravel. Perhaps the government would fracture. Perhaps public unrest would spread through the country. And perhaps, without its most powerful figure, the Islamic Republic would simply collapse. But Iran did not collapse. Within hours of the strikes, the country began responding. Missiles launched toward Israeli territory. Drones moved across the region toward U.S. interests and allied military bases. Air defenses were mobilized across Iranian cities. The conflict that had begun as a sudden aerial campaign was now turning into a wider regional war. The human cost began rising almost immediately. Iranian officials reported that more than 1,200 people had been killed in the attacks, including civilians. Among them were more than 160 children who died when a school was struck during the bombing. 7 American soldiers were also reported killed as the conflict expanded across the region. But beyond the destruction, something else quickly became clear. This war did not appear to follow a single, clearly stated strategy. Washington had launched one of the most dramatic military operations in the region in decades. Yet, no one seemed entirely certain how it was supposed to end. And as the days passed, the statements coming from the White House only made that question more complicated. As the bombing campaign continued, attention quickly shifted from the battlefield to Washington. Because the question was no longer just what had happened. It was what came next. And on that question, President Donald Trump's messaging began to shift almost daily. In the first hours after the strikes, the tone appeared almost conciliatory. Trump publicly called on members of Iran's powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to lay down their arms. In exchange, he suggested, they could receive immunity. The message implied that the United States was not necessarily seeking to destroy the Iranian state, only to remove those currently running it. Then the tone changed. Trump began addressing the Iranian public directly. "To the great people of Iran," he said, "the hour of freedom is at hand." When the war was finished, he suggested, Iranians themselves should take over their government. The statement hinted at something far more ambitious than a limited military campaign. It sounded like regime change, but the message did not stop there. Within days, Trump posted a far more uncompromising demand. "There will be no deal with Iran," he wrote, "except unconditional surrender." The shift was dramatic. First, an offer of immunity to members of Iran's leadership. Then, encouragement for a domestic uprising. And finally, a demand for total capitulation. To analysts watching the war unfold, the contradictions were striking. Each message pointed toward a different possible outcome. One suggested negotiation, another suggested revolution, and the last suggested complete military defeat. Yet the bombs continued to fall while these messages changed, which raised a deeper question. Was this confusion, or was the United States deliberately pursuing multiple strategies at once? Because if the statements from Washington were confusing observers outside the war, they were likely sending signals inside Iran as well. By the end of the first week, the war had already reshaped the region. Missile exchanges continued across the Middle East. Oil facilities were damaged. Air defenses fired through the night in multiple countries. But the deeper uncertainty was not on the battlefield. It was in the strategy behind it. Because normally, wars begin with a clear objective: capture territory, destroy an enemy army, force negotiations. But in this case, the objective seemed harder to define. The United States had launched a massive military campaign, striking nearly 2,000 targets across Iran. It had eliminated senior Iranian commanders, it had assassinated the country's supreme leader, and it had crippled parts of Iran's military infrastructure. Yet Washington never clearly explained what the final outcome was supposed to be. Was the goal to collapse the Iranian government entirely? Was it to weaken Iran enough to force a new nuclear deal? Was it meant to spark internal unrest that would topple the leadership from within? Or was it simply to destroy Iran's military capabilities and then declare victory? Each possibility implied a very different war. A short campaign could achieve some of these goals. Others could require years of conflict. And some might not be achievable through military force at all. As analysts around the world began examining the signals coming from Washington, a number of possible strategies started to emerge. Different paths, different risks, different endings to the same war. And understanding those possibilities would become the key to answering the most important question of all. What is the real endgame? One of the most widely discussed theories behind the war is also the most dramatic: that the United States was attempting to trigger the collapse of the Iranian regime itself. The logic behind this strategy is not new. Modern governments, especially centralized systems like Iran's, often revolve around a small number of powerful figures. Remove those figures quickly enough, the theory goes, and the entire structure may begin to unravel. The opening strikes appeared designed with that possibility in mind. Within hours of the first attacks, several senior Iranian officials were reported killed. Military commanders, security leaders, and key figures inside the state apparatus were suddenly gone. But the most significant target was Ali Khamenei. For nearly 4 decades, Khamenei had been the ultimate authority in Iran. As supreme leader, he held power over the military, the judiciary, and the country's strategic direction. His death was not just the removal of a political leader, it was the removal of the central pillar of the entire system. Some analysts believe the objective was simple: strike fast, eliminate the leadership, create confusion inside the regime, and hope that the pressure would trigger a chain reaction. Without a supreme leader, the ruling establishment might fracture. Different factions could begin competing for power. The public, already struggling under sanctions and economic pressure, might take to the streets. If that happened, the government could face pressure from both above and below at the same time. Collapse might follow. Some observers argue that this was the expectation behind the opening operation. The objective of the strikes, one analyst suggested, was instant capitulation of the regime and a popular uprising. But events inside Iran did not unfold that way. Instead of descending into chaos, the political system moved quickly to stabilize itself. Within days, Iran announced a successor. Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of the former supreme leader, was named as the new leader of the Islamic Republic. The decision sent a clear signal. The system was still functioning, the leadership vacuum had been filled, and the institutions of the state, particularly the powerful Revolutionary Guard, appeared to be rallying around the new figure at the top. Rather than collapse, the regime seemed to consolidate. In fact, some analysts argue that the attack may have had the opposite effect. External threats often strengthen governments rather than weaken them. War can create a rally-around-the-flag effect, uniting political factions that might otherwise compete. Instead of fragmentation, Iran's leadership closed ranks. And if the goal had been immediate regime collapse, the first weeks of the war suggested that strategy had already failed. If the collapse of the Iranian regime was the most dramatic possible outcome of the war, there was another strategy that required far less chaos. Instead of overthrowing the system from the outside, Washington might try to fracture it from within. Iran's political structure is not controlled by a single institution. Power is divided between clerical authorities, government ministries, military commanders, and the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the IRGC. In theory, if enough of these actors could be convinced that the war was unwinnable, the leadership might begin to split. Some factions might seek survival rather than resistance. Others might try to negotiate their own position in whatever political system emerged after the war. And if those divisions widened enough, the regime could weaken without collapsing outright. Early in the conflict, President Trump appeared to signal exactly that kind of strategy. He publicly called on members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard to lay down their weapons. Those who surrendered, he suggested, could receive immunity. The message was unusual. It was directed not at Iran's government as a whole, but at the individuals inside it. At the same time, similar signals were reportedly sent toward Iranian diplomats and officials abroad. If they abandoned the current leadership, they might still have a place in Iran's future. But the response from Tehran was swift and decisive. Iranian diplomats issued public statements rejecting the offer. They insisted they remained loyal representatives of the Islamic Republic. Inside the country, the Revolutionary Guard also made its position clear. The IRGC pledged full obedience to the newly appointed supreme leader. For many analysts, the outcome was predictable. In times of war, regimes rarely fracture easily. External pressure often produces the opposite effect. Political elites close ranks. Internal disagreements are pushed aside, and survival becomes the dominant priority. In fact, some experts argue that the very act of attacking Iran may have strengthened the unity of its leadership. Instead of dividing the system, the war may have reinforced it, which meant that if Washington had hoped to split Iran's elite apart from the inside, that strategy, too, was showing little sign of success. A third explanation for the war is far simpler than regime change. The United States may not be trying to overthrow Iran's government at all. Instead, the objective could be to destroy the country's military capabilities so thoroughly that it can no longer threaten the region. From the very beginning of the conflict, many of the targets chosen by U.S. and Israeli forces pointed in that direction. Air defense systems were among the first to be hit. Radar stations, surface-to-air missile batteries, command centers that coordinated Iran's airspace. Within days, much of Iran's defensive network had been severely damaged, allowing American and Israeli aircraft to operate with far greater freedom above parts of the country. At the same time, strikes focused heavily on Iran's missile infrastructure. Ballistic missile launch sites were destroyed. Factories producing drones and missile components were targeted. Storage depots and launch vehicles were hit repeatedly. Naval forces were also attacked. Warships, patrol boats, and coastal defense systems were struck both inside Iranian waters and beyond. According to military officials, hundreds of missiles, launchers, and drones were destroyed during the first phase of the campaign. The logic behind this strategy is clear. Iran's influence in the region relies heavily on its military tools. Ballistic missiles that can strike cities and bases across the Middle East, drones that can travel long distances and overwhelm air defenses, naval forces capable of threatening shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. If those capabilities are weakened or eliminated, Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders would shrink dramatically. From this perspective, the war could be less about overthrowing the regime and more about permanently degrading the military systems that support it. But even this strategy raises difficult questions. Destroying military hardware is something air power can accomplish. Bombers can eliminate missile sites, fighter jets can destroy naval vessels, cyber operations can disrupt communications and command networks. Yet military destruction does not automatically produce political outcomes. A government can survive even after losing large portions of its armed forces. History has shown this repeatedly. Countries can rebuild, weapons can be replaced, and leadership can adapt, which means that even if the United States succeeds in severely damaging Iran's military, that alone may not determine how the war ultimately ends. Because destroying weapons is one thing. Changing the political reality of a country is something else entirely. Another possibility behind the war goes even further than weakening Iran's government. It suggests that Washington may be trying to shape what comes after it. Because once Iran's supreme leader was killed, a political vacuum opened at the very top of the country's power structure, and whoever filled that position would determine the future direction of the Islamic Republic. In Iran's system, the supreme leader is not just a symbolic figure. He controls the military, he influences the judiciary, and he has enormous authority over the country's foreign policy and nuclear strategy. Which means the identity of the next leader matters enormously, not just for Iran, but for the entire region. In the days following the assassination of Ali Khamenei, the question of succession quickly became one of the most sensitive issues in the conflict. President Trump made his views unusually clear. He publicly rejected the idea that Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, should inherit the position. According to multiple reports, Trump called him unacceptable and suggested that the United States should have some influence over who ultimately leads Iran. The statement was extraordinary. Foreign governments rarely claim a role in selecting the leadership of another sovereign state. Yet Trump argued that the next Iranian leader should be someone capable of bringing harmony and peace to the country and the region. Inside Iran, however, the reaction was immediate. The leadership rejected the idea of outside involvement entirely. And within days, the country's powerful clerical body, the Assembly of Experts, moved forward with its own decision. Mojtaba Khamenei was chosen as the new supreme leader. The appointment carried its own symbolism. For the first time since the 1979 revolution, Iran appeared to be moving toward something resembling dynastic succession. But politically, the message was clear. Iran's leadership would not allow Washington to decide its future. Instead of opening the door to outside influence, the new appointment appeared to close it. And if the United States had hoped to shape Iran's next leadership from the outside, that plan had now run directly into the reality of how power inside the Islamic Republic actually works. If none of the earlier strategies produced the desired outcome, there remained one final possibility: that the war could grow larger, far larger. From the beginning of the conflict, some analysts warned that the air campaign against Iran might only be the opening phase of a much broader confrontation. One option discussed in strategic circles involved opening new fronts against Iran from within the region itself. In particular, attention focused on Kurdish groups. For decades, Kurdish forces in Iraq and Syria have maintained relationships with the United States and its allies. Some of these groups operate relatively close to Iran's western border. In theory, if Kurdish fighters launched attacks inside Iranian territory, the conflict could take on a new dimension. Internal unrest could combine with external military pressure, and Iran's government would suddenly face threats from multiple directions at once. Reports suggested that American officials had at least discussed the possibility with Kurdish leaders, but turning that idea into reality would be extremely risky. Iran is home to its own Kurdish population, and any attempt to trigger an armed uprising could ignite ethnic tensions across the region. Neighboring countries such as Turkey, which has long fought Kurdish insurgent groups, might also react strongly to such a move. Instead of weakening Iran alone, the strategy could destabilize multiple countries at the same time. And there was another option that carried even greater risks: a ground invasion. So far, the war had been fought largely through airstrikes, missiles, and drones. But throughout the conflict, the United States had never completely ruled out sending troops into Iran. Iran's foreign minister warned that his country was preparing for that possibility. Still, most analysts believe such a move would be extraordinarily unlikely. A ground war against Iran would be vastly larger than the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Iran's population is more than twice as large. Its geography is mountainous and difficult to control, and its military, though damaged by the air campaign, remains capable of organizing a prolonged resistance. There is also the political reality inside the United States. Donald Trump returned to power, promising to end America's long wars in the Middle East. Launching a massive ground invasion would run directly against that message. It could provoke enormous opposition at home, especially with elections approaching, which is why many experts believe that expanding the war on the ground remains the least likely path forward. But in conflicts like this, the danger is not always what leaders plan. It is what events force them to do next. After examining all the possibilities, regime collapse, elite fragmentation, military destruction, leadership engineering, or a wider war, analysts increasingly began pointing toward a different explanation, one that was less dramatic, but far more realistic. Because throughout the conflict, one pattern kept reappearing: pressure, followed by the suggestion of a deal. Despite the intensity of the bombing campaign, President Trump repeatedly returned to the language of negotiation. Even as missiles continued to fall, he hinted that the war could still end with an agreement, not necessarily the overthrow of Iran's government, but a settlement that forced Iran to make major concessions. For many observers, this raised the possibility that the war itself was meant to create leverage. In other words, the bombing campaign might not be designed to destroy the Iranian state entirely. It might be designed to push it to the negotiating table under far worse conditions than before. This strategy is often described as coercive diplomacy. The idea is straightforward. Apply overwhelming military pressure, demonstrate the ability to destroy critical infrastructure, signal that escalation could continue indefinitely, and then offer a path toward peace if the other side accepts certain terms. In this scenario, the war becomes less about conquest and more about bargaining power. And the demands themselves have already been hinted at: restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program, limits on its nuclear activities, and changes to its regional influence, particularly through allied militias across the Middle East. If Iran agreed to these conditions, the United States could claim that the war had achieved its objectives. The Iranian government would remain in place, but its strategic capabilities would be sharply reduced. For President Trump, the political advantages of such an outcome would be clear. He could argue that the campaign had eliminated the supreme leader responsible for decades of confrontation. He could point to destroyed missile facilities and damaged military infrastructure, and he could present a new agreement as proof that maximum pressure had worked. Victory, in this sense, would not require occupying Tehran. It would only require redefining what success looks like. Some analysts believe this approach fits closely with Trump's long-standing negotiating style: escalate pressure dramatically, create a sense of crisis, and then present a deal as the only reasonable way to stop the escalation. One security expert suggested that Washington might ultimately be willing to reach an understanding with elements inside the Iranian system itself, even figures connected to the Revolutionary Guard, if those actors were prepared to stabilize the country while accepting new limits on its military capabilities. Such an outcome would allow both sides to claim a form of victory. Iran could say that it had survived the war and preserved the Islamic Republic. The United States could say that it had forced Iran to retreat from its most threatening programs, and the war could end without the enormous risks of a full invasion or the chaos of regime collapse. But there is one problem with this theory. It assumes that Iran is willing to negotiate under pressure. So far, Tehran has shown little interest in doing so. Iranian officials have insisted that negotiations cannot take place while the country is under bombardment. They have rejected the idea of surrender, and they have repeatedly stated that Iran will not accept a leadership imposed from outside. Instead of moving toward compromise, the Iranian government has focused on demonstrating resilience. Missile launches continue, military mobilization continues, and political messaging inside the country emphasizes resistance. From Tehran's perspective, accepting a deal immediately after the assassination of its supreme leader could appear like capitulation, which means that even if coercive diplomacy is the intended strategy, it may not work as planned. History offers many examples of wars that began with the expectation of quick political outcomes, wars that leaders believed could be carefully controlled. But conflicts have a way of developing their own momentum. Once missiles begin flying and lives are lost, the pressure on both sides changes. Domestic politics become involved, public anger grows, and leaders may find themselves pushed toward escalation rather than compromise. If the real objective of the war is negotiation, then the coming weeks may determine whether that strategy succeeds. Because at some point, both sides will have to decide whether they are willing to stop the war, or whether the search for victory will push the conflict even further. And that decision may ultimately determine not just the future of Iran, but the stability of the entire region. For now, the war continues. Missiles still cross the skies of the Middle East, air defenses remain on high alert, and the political future of Iran, and perhaps the region, remains uncertain. What makes this conflict especially dangerous is not just the scale of the fighting. It is the lack of a clearly defined ending. Some wars begin with precise objectives: capture a city, destroy an army, force a treaty. But this war appears to have started with several possible outcomes at once: regime collapse, military destruction, negotiation under pressure, or even a broader regional confrontation. Each path leads to a very different future, and each carries risks that could reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. Iran's leadership has already signaled that it will not surrender. Israel sees the conflict as part of a larger effort to reshape the region after the attacks of October 7, 2023. And the United States may still be defining what victory actually looks like. History shows that wars begun under conditions of strategic ambiguity rarely end quickly. They evolve, they expand, and sometimes they take directions that no one originally intended. For now, one thing is certain: the events that began with a single night of strikes have already changed the region. But whether they will end in negotiation, escalation, or something far more unpredictable is a question that remains unanswered.